I'm Monica Malpass on Inside Story. Is Lynn Abraham's fainting spell enough to effectively end her run for Philadelphia mayor? We'll discuss that. We'll also talk to freshman Congressman Boyle on Inside Story. Good morning again. Welcome to Inside Story. We want to welcome freshman Congressman Boyle from the 13th Congressional District. Thank you so much for being here. Big transition for you. You were elected a year ago down in D.C. working on the big issues. And among them are a couple that are very serious to Americans, like paycheck fairness. I know you've been a big supporter of that. Tell me about that.
Well, so I'm a co-sponsor of a bill along with a longtime Congresswoman Rosa DeLaura. This is one of these issues that always gets talked about and yet never gets resolved. It is a disgrace right now that in the United States of America, in the year 2015, women could be working in the same exact position, same exact job, same qualifications, making 72 cents on the dollar for what a man makes in the same position. So paycheck fairness, I think we actually have a real chance to pass this year, despite the fact on the Democratic side we're in the minority. I think there has been movement, some on the Republican side of the aisle. It's absolutely needed. And there's some who say, well, you know, of course that's wrong, but legislation isn't really needed. The market will fix itself. Well, it hasn't. And the market hasn't fixed itself for 50 years. And we've clearly had instance after instance come out in the courts that show women are discriminated against at places in the workplace. So having that paycheck fairness is incredibly important. It's a women's issue, but it's also a broader economic issue.
And do you have bipartisan support on it?
I have some. I would like to get more, but we're continuing to reach out, and I am confident if it were called for a vote tomorrow, there are absolutely the votes to pass it. The question is getting Republican leadership to actually call it. And
that's the trick right now, because the Congress is very much at a loggerheads, as it has been for a long time. I know that's going to be the tricky part with keeping the Affordable Care Act in place. Republicans have that in their vision, of course, as one of their top 3 things to tumble in Washington. They want to cut Medicaid as well. They also want to shrink the Pell Grants. So how hard is it to try to put forth some legislation knowing you have such a hard roadblock ahead of you?
It's always difficult, but I face the same thing as a state legislator in Harrisburg, especially at a time of divided government, when you have the legislature in the hands of one party and the exact, whether it's a governor's mansion in Pennsylvania or the White House in D.C., when it's in the hands of another party, you're going to have that friction. Hopefully, it doesn't prevent everything from happening, that people can actually come together. Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton in the 1990s were a great example of 2 very partisan folks who actually came together and produced some landmark pieces of legislation and compromise. My concern right now is that, unfortunately, particularly on the Republican side, you have about 35 so-called Tea Party members who absolutely refuse to allow Speaker Boehner to call up any sort of compromise legislation that would pass overwhelmingly.
So they won't even budge an inch, it doesn't sound like.
The funding of Homeland Security passed 3-1. About half of the House Republicans voted for it. Every single Democrat voted for it. That was the bill that he wouldn't bring up for 4 months because of feeling that he was held hostage by the extreme voices in his caucus. We have to break away from allowing the extreme voices to dictate to the other 70–80% of us.
That's the hard part. And I know you support the Social Security 2100 Act, which would extend Social Security and balance it, if you will, on an actuarial basis, but it would make it solvent for another 75 years. Otherwise, it will be only another 10 or 11. That seems like that would be a win for everyone on paper, but there could be some pushback there, too.
There certainly has been pushback. You know, this is part ideological. I mean, there are those who are attempting to push the point of view that Social Security is running out of money and needs to dramatically be changed. I always point out the fact that in the 80 years of its existence, Social Security has always run a surplus. It's always actually brought in more revenue than it's paid out. You had, during that entire period of time, that surplus being spent on other government priorities. Now, you do have a situation where, beginning in the early 2030s, because of a demographic shift, you won't have enough money coming in for the first time ever to pay all the expenditures going out. But there are little fixes we can do to the system now that don't include benefit cuts. We just make these fixes now, could actually extend the program to 2100. I'm very concerned that as a country we're getting away from these sort of retirement security programs and privatizing everything. There is absolutely a role for the private sector and for vigorous business expansion. But there is also a role for government, too. Social Security has been a tremendous success. We have to do everything to save it and preserve the integrity of it.
And quickly, student loan refinancing, that would seem again like something that people could get behind from both sides of the aisle, but not always.
No, well, this is a personal issue to me, as I'm one of the members, few members of Congress who himself has tens of thousands of dollars of student loan debt, being on the younger side. This is an enormous problem, not just for an entire generation and a future generation coming up, but it is actually an economic problem for the whole country. Student loan debt is now the largest source of debt in the United States.
Wow.
It's over $1 trillion.
So it bears looking at.
It has gone up fivefold just in the last decade. So that is actually having a drag on our overall economy, and that's not just me saying, it's actually Wall Street banks that have pointed that out. So making sure that we can refinance this existing debt at a lower interest rate, making it easier for people to repay, actually not forgiving any of the debt, but just simply refinancing it, that would put more money in their pockets that they can in turn spend in the economy.
All right, Congressman Boyle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
We'll have our Inside Story panel coming up next to discuss the issues.